What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be diving into 10 cards that I think will be pretty good come rotation in Standard, as we now have a better idea of how Dominaria is going to affect the overall format of, what the next Standard could look like, as we have a better understanding of what mechanics and what other cards will be introduced in said new format. I do think, some of these cards maybe have been neglected in the past, but because these cards may have a little bit more cards to work around with and may make them overall better. This is definitely something that that may help these cards overall perform better, as well as because we haven't gotten any playtesting of the new format like we have in the past. Some of these cards are kind of like maybe they could be good just because we don't have as many things currently. Does that mean that these cards will be good for the rest of Standard? Once we get other sets that release outside of Dominaria United. Time will only tell. But with that being said, let's just dive into the cards and let's just start talking about them. So the first card up on the list is going to be Dig Up. This is kind of a unique card that I feel like has made plays here and there in Standard, but I do think with the idea of Domain being a new mechanic with Dominaria United, this is a card that could get better, as it is a card that for 1 mana you get to search your library for a basic land card and put it into your hand, then shuffle. Or you can play the cleave cost, which is 4 mana, and then search for any card for 4 mana, which isn't that bad. It does have some room for improvement, but if you're looking to play a deck that is, possibly playing, up to 3 colors, maybe even trying to play 5 colors to try to take full advantage of Domain, I do think Dig Up is kind of like that useful, let me find the land that I'm missing from my hand, and this will help me fix my mana. There's a lot of things here because Domain relies on basic land types, making sure you at least hit your basic land types, even if you only have a one-off, like a swamp or a mountain or something like that, that just to kind of hit those, checks with Domain. This card could be overall pretty good as like a early on mana fixer type card that you can earn in the early game, get that one basic land type you're missing, and then as the game goes on, you can move into getting any card that you may need in that particular situation. Next card up is going to be Cemetery Prowler. Now, this is a card that I think, because of Old Growth Troll and Mono Green, this is kind of a card that didn't really see a ton of play. It's a pretty good card for 3 mana. It is a 3/4 wolf that has vigilance, enters the battlefield or attacks. You get to exile a card from a graveyard. Spells you cast 1 less to cast for each card that they share types with the Cemetery Prowler. Cards exiled with Cemetery Prowler. And this is actually where it gets unique, right? Because of the new cards that make your that you could pay life instead of paying the mana cost, like if it's a green card, instead of paying that forest symbol, it'll make that card cost less. Then combined with Cemetery Prowler, this could be kind of that 1-2 punch that Mono Green maybe needs to kind of maybe try to play these cheaper cards early on. And if you get Cemetery Prowler out on curve and attack it with it by like turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, or so on and so forth, it is a card that can definitely make some of your green creatures, especially your bigger ones, that much cheaper, which is definitely good. And then combine that with the card that gives all your cards that you would cast with green mana in them. If you pay 2 life, you then make them cost less. So let's just say you could get a Titan of Industry for maybe like 4 mana, something crazy like that. It's one of those things, like I said, Old Gold Troll I think was overall better just because you got a 4/4 for 3 mana, and then if it died, it would go as an enchantment on your land, which would then help you ramp up a little bit more in the mana, and then you can always sacrifice that land to then make a new Old Gold Troll essentially token. But I do think Cemetery Prowler makes a way if you are someone who plays mono green and you're looking for a card. I think Cemetery Prowler is kind of that one card that kind of, maybe makes a presence in, the current Standard. Next card up is going to be Concealing Curtains. This is another card that, I don't think it saw a ton of play. I mean, maybe in more control matchups, as I do think even Shambling Ghast or Eye Twitch were a much better option here at the 1-drop slot, with this being a rare and only being a 0/4 defender wall with a transform ability that is okay. It's not really great. I do think this is kind of one of those cards because we don't really get too many other cards that really replace that 1-drop slot in the new Standard. This is kind of that card that could, absorb some of this more aggressive damage that some decks may form from, like if Boros aggro is still a thing or a mono white aggro. A 0/4 on turn 1 is definitely something that will, prevent your life total going down pretty quickly. The other thing too is sure, the fact that you can transform it as a sorcery, which is, not the greatest thing, as it is pretty costly as it takes 3 mana. You maybe not want to do it if you have a better 3-drop. Maybe you want to wait until the games later on. But the idea here is you can choose an online card from your opponent's hand, make them discard it. But the downside is they do get to draw a card or kind of replace that card. But you could hit a crucial card that they may be looking to play to follow up. But still, overall, I think it's a pretty decent card. If it's a hole, I think Mono Black does have, or any deck that plays black that maybe lacking Eye Twitch and or Shambling Ghast, I think Concealing Curtains will see some more play, as it starts out a defender, but then eventually becomes a 3/4 menace, which is still pretty good as your opponent still has to commit 2 creatures to block with it. But yet again, an overall interesting card that I do think we'll see some people experiment with it, if not end up playing it all out, especially in like the mono black deck. What are you going to do on turn 1 outside the new card that comes with the cleric human guy that you pay mana and you kind of invest in him and level him up. This is definitely another card that you could play in that 1-drop slot. Now, the next card up is another interesting one here, right? We lose a little bit of overall removal in black, and the card's going to be Bloodline Calling. It's a 3-mana instant speed removal spell that target creature gets -5/-5 at end of turn. Creature tokens get -2/-2 to end of turn. And the reason why I think this is kind of a card that's pretty interesting and maybe we'll see some play is I do think there's a lot of cards currently that are in standard and will be coming out in Dominaria United that will create a bunch of tokens in one way or the other. And having that option to minus the tokens or even a single creature is definitely a good option. Maybe you're an aggressive deck and you're not really looking to wipe out your side of the board with a Meat Hook Massacre, but this is definitely a good point removal kind of like thing. If your opponent's a very high token style deck that creates a lot of creature tokens, -2/-2 on tokens is definitely very good. Does gets around indestructible and things like that. And like I said, the 3-mana -5/-5 is also good. As we really only have Infernal Grasp as really the only effective removal spell currently in standard. There is the new one that you can destroy target creature for 2 mana that is with power and toughness not greater than or less than 5. There's also Hero's Downfall, which also hits planeswalkers. There's there's a couple other options, but I do think this is kind of one of those other kind of removal spells, as we are still trying to find out what mono black is going to do when it comes to removal, that you could kind of experiment with and kind of see how it overall does. Is it something that, like, if there aren't a ton of token decks that will pop up, maybe this is where you maybe slot it out for a Hero's Downfall if there's still a balance of creatures and planeswalker style decks. This is definitely one of those slots, like I said, you can experiment with. It may be good in the beginning, but as the standard develops, it could fall off a little bit. But it's definitely a card to experiment with, I guess, if you are looking to find some replacement removal for a black deck or Orzhov or any deck that plays black in general. Now, the next card up is another card that it's definitely interesting here, right, with like any deck that plays white, but there is an emphasis in like on some of the cards from Dominaria United that involves auras and equipments. And the next card up is going to be Lion Sash. This is kind of a unique card too. It hits graveyards, as it's an interesting card that for 1 mana you can exile a card from graveyard if it was a permanent card, meaning that it was anything but an instant or sorcery. You get to put a +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash, and then when you equip it, equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash. And this is definitely also interesting here. Yet again, there may be decks that, use some sort of mill strategy, put cards in their graveyard or flash cards back, and you can actually hit those cards with the Lion Sash there. There's also, like I said, an emphasis on some of the cards from Dominaria United that this card could fit in because it allows you to, it uses equipments or auras, and this is definitely a good equipment, I would say, as it does a little bit, to make itself bigger if it's just an equipment that's not equipped to anything because it's still a creature, or if it's equipped to a creature that you can also use it to pump that creature. Overall, very interesting kind of, equipment, I would say that, like I said, I feel like it saw some play, but I don't think it saw a ton of play, and could see a lot more play come post-rotation. Now, the next card up is going to be Hedetsu Consumes All. It's a 3-mana enchantment that is, from Kamigawa. It is a mythic. It is kind of one of these things that I feel like, there was better options in the 3-mana slot. But if you are someone who's maybe playing like Grixis Control, or maybe if you even are just playing like Rakdos, it's definitely an interesting card to maybe take a look at, as it is a saga that does have 3 decent abilities. The first one is destroy each non-land permanent, mana value 1 or less. Like I said, if standard develops and there's a ton of decks that are playing tokens or things that are very low costing, that first ability is definitely very good. You don't have to play it early. You can kind of wait until the board sets up and then kind of, for 3 mana, wipe out the board. The second chapter is exile all graveyards. Like I said, I have a feeling that there are going to be a lot of decks that will play some stuff that will, either play stuff back from the graveyard or, try to put stuff in the graveyard to get some sort of benefit. We have seen some cards, like I think there's a Lagoif that it's based on how many creature cards in your graveyard. It gets plus, power and toughness based on how many creatures. So it's definitely, a card that does have some utility in the first 2 chapters. And the third chapter is that you get a creature out of it that's a 3/3 trample. And then whenever it deals damage, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. Whenever it deals damage to a player and has dealt 10 or more damage this turn, they lose the game. It's definitely, upside. These sagas from Kamigawa having a creature on the backside of all of them are definitely very good. I do think it's an okay, kind of removal spell. Like I said, if you're not looking to really wipe out, a bunch of creatures that are on your side of the board and you don't play a lot of tokens, the first ability could hit a lot of token style decks. I don't know if it's a card that we'll see a lot of like main deck play, but yet again, it will all depend on how the meta develops. But like I said, I have this weird feeling that graveyard stuff and maybe token stuff may be prominent just because there are a lot of things like that do those type of effects. Now, the next card up is going to be a card that really, talks about, throwing things in the graveyard. And I feel like it sees play here and there, but doesn't see a ton of play. And that card's going to be Sludgeerk, the Overslime. It's a 3-mana 3/3 trampler that whenever a land is put into the graveyard from anywhere, put a +1/+1 counter on Sludgeerk. And then you get to remove 3 slime counters on it, return to the hand, and whenever he leaves the battlefield, return up to 3 target cards from graveyard to your hand. So he's another interesting card that I feel like saw some play. Like I said, it hasn't seen a ton of play, but would there being a lot of decks, or even in like maybe the Sultai colors, there are a lot of cards in those colors that are trying to put things in the graveyard to get some sort of benefit from. And if you end up in those those colors end up milling, some lands into the graveyard, I do think that's definitely, an overall benefit. And on top of that, we do have the Kamigawa lands, which also makes this card pretty good, as if this card ends up leaving the battlefield at some point, get some of those lands back into your hand, which are always good. Then be able to kind of replay them, which is definitely pretty sweet. And, for 3 mana and getting a 3/3 trampler, that is still a pretty good value, I think, overall. It's definitely a cool card. Like I said, I feel like there's some synergy here in what we have currently and what will come in Dominaria United that will make this card maybe pretty playable. I definitely am. I've been messing around with some decks, and this is kind of one of those cards I'm trying to make a deck out of by playing like that creature slash self milled style of deck, and this is probably a card that kind of makes that deck work overall. Next card up is going to be Ginny Fay Jetmir Second. This is yet again another card that I feel like saw a lot of play when Streets of New Capenna came out. A lot of people were trying to play out creature decks. I think this is a card that gets better, and it does have some versatility, as you can play it for Naya colors, you can play it for Gruul colors, you can play it for Selesnya colors, you can just play it for mono green colors, and it's kind of one of those cards that has some versatility here, that whenever you create a token, you can instead change that token from whatever it is. If it's a treasure token, blood token, creature token, you can change it to a 2/2 cat or a 3/1 dog, which then gives you some sort of board presence. There are a lot of cards that create tokens in general in any of those colors, and like I said, there's even more in Dominaria United that will even gain benefit from this. And then on top of that, there are some cards that are elves. So there's some cards that came in Dominaria United that will help elves out. I don't know if there's enough elves to really make an elf deck come in standard, but maybe over the course of the releases in the next year, we'll get more elves overall, and this card is another card that will gain benefit from elves. Still overall a very good card, and having many ways to kind of produce tokens in one way or the other. This card I think could see a ton of play as well, just because it turns any token you make into a creature, and just having many versatile ways to make those said tokens makes this card I think even better. It's definitely a card I think your opponent is going to want to immediately remove, and if they can't remove it, they may get overwhelmed by all the tokens that you may then end up creating. And then the last card up in the multicolor cards that I thought were kind of interesting, and maybe they didn't see a ton of play, would be Old Stick Fingers. This is a card that actually is very unique in the way that it kind of synergizes very well with like a deck like with like a Sludgeerk or something. That it's an X, a black and a green, and it's a legendary horror creature that whenever you cast a spell, you may reveal the top cards of your library into reveal X creature cards. Put all the creature cards revealed this way into your graveyard. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any random order. And then its power and toughness equal number of creature cards in your graveyard. So, like I said, there's a lot of cards that are trying to mill yourself, not only in current standard and also in Dominaria United. This is a card that benefits from those said cards, just like how Sludgeerk does as well. This is definitely a good card too. It doesn't have trample, it doesn't have death touch, it doesn't have anything else like that. But it's a card that it's on the battlefield that your opponent's going to want to deal with, just because if you're self-milling yourself, you have like 10 creatures in the graveyard. Your opponent's either going to have to deal with your graveyard, or they're going to have to deal with Old Stick Fingers because you have a 10/10 on the battlefield. So it's definitely a unique card. It's definitely a card that, yet again, I'm messing around in like that Sludgeerk self-mill Sultai color deck. It's definitely a good card, I would say. It's like I said, I just think the self-mill strategy of putting creatures in the graveyard just wasn't, I guess, quick enough for the current standard. But I do think it's kind of a deck that may pop up in post-rotation standard, and I'm kind of trying to work on a deck that kind of evolves this, and that's why I kind of feel like Old Stick Fingers could be playable. Now, the next card up is another card that, targets a graveyard. As you can see, there's probably a trend here overall, with what I am doing, with what my selection is. And the next card up is going to be Unlicensed Hearse. It's a 2-mana artifact vehicle that you get to exile up to 2 cards from a graveyard, 2 target cards from a single graveyard, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of cards exiled with it. So if your opponent's playing, a mill strategy or just playing cards that maybe have some sort of value in their graveyard, you can always exile it with the Unlicensed Hearse, and over time, the Unlicensed Hearse gets more and more cards on it, and your opponent has to either deal with the artifact before it turns into a creature, or when it turns into a creature, they have to deal with the Unlicensed Hearse. And on top of that, even if they destroy it, it's not like those cards go back in the graveyard. They're exiled from the game for the rest of the game. So it's definitely, yet again, another card that I think didn't see a ton of play, but because, the standard's a little more limited, as people may try to do some, combat tricks or things with graveyard, I do think this is kind of one of those cards that does gain a benefit from it, just because you maybe not want your opponent to return something back from the graveyard, recast a spell from the graveyard, or just gain benefits from having creatures in the graveyard. I think Unlicensed Hearse is kind of like that kind of forgotten about artifact. Like I said, I do think there's decks that do play it. I just don't think it is as prominent as it may become in a post-rotation standard, where there may be a lot more stuff that involve using cards from graveyards to one way or the other. So definitely a very, very good card, I would say, at least, even for just 2 mana. Now, the last card up is kind of just like a, it's an extra benefit here, and I left it for the end just because I don't think it's like anything super important. But it's definitely a card cards, I would say, because it's a group of them, that get better with the new Dominaria United, and those are going to be the Triomes. As if you are someone who's trying to play Domain, even if you only play 3 colors, the Triomes get better just because they are lands. They're not basic lands, but they are lands that include 3 land types on them, and that's like an important key thing for anything Domain. So even if you are playing a 3-color deck, maybe you want to sprinkle in a Domain card or 2 because you are playing the Triomes. And on top of that, you can pay 3 mana and cycle them and get a card draw out of them, which also makes it very versatile. And also, looking at like a more mid-range to a long game style deck, Triomes and the slow lands are probably better options than paying pain lands, just because you are a slower deck. If you are playing best of 1, pain lands in a control deck or a mid-range deck is definitely going to hurt you in the longer, just because those aggressive decks are going to want to deal a bunch of damage to you. And then, having to pay life in order to create a particular color is going to hurt you in the long run. So I do think that's why I think the Triomes are overall better cards to play in a more mid-range to, long game style deck. Just because, you don't have to pay life, though they do come in the battlefield tapped. They are more versatile, I would say, than the pain lands that will be introduced, as I do think the pain lands are really only for the more aggressive / mid-range decks that are the more aggressive side. So I do think, if you are a player who's looking to play any sort of Domain, you want to include these on top of, I think, the new basic commons as well, to maybe sprinkle a couple of those in, because the basic commons also include land types on them. Even though they're just regular lands, you can't search for them with any card that says basic land cards. But still, none the least, these are cards that I think get better in a post-rotation standard, just because there are like fewer ways to filter mana, and not every deck is going to want to play a bunch of pain lands, because as much as they create 2 different colors, you still have to pay life in order to do said things with your deck. But that is my list. There was no particular order in how I ordered this. I just really just put them in piles on my screen. So that's kind of how I went about, just kind of reading through what I put together. I know there are cards that I probably forgot, and there are colors I didn't even really pull cards from. And it's nothing against those colors. It's just like there are cards that are in those colors that I do think will see more play. I just didn't think, they were cards that people haven't seen a ton of play of. I tried my best to pull cards out that maybe haven't seen a ton of play overall in Standard outside of the Triomes. And kind of like talk through those cards, as I do think, as we get into a smaller card pool, some of these cards may be more prominent just because there are less cards to pick from and choose from to actually make a deck work. But with that being said, if you liked the video or had any comments, let me know in the comments below. Hit that like button if you liked it. If you're new here, you want to post new videos on the channel like this one, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.